Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, where about 12 million slaves were captured and brought to the Americas and Europe, the Arab slave trade was quite different. Formally beginning in the early 600 AD, even though it existed before that, the Arab slave trade resulted in the enslavement of about 17 million individuals of various ethnicities. However, Arabs did not use slaves for labor only. From soldiers, administrators, governors, generals, artists, and concubines who would later enter the royal court and family, the Arab slave trade was quite different and unique. Even the captured slaves founded dynasties and invaded lands, ruling them for decades. So, what's the history of the Arab slave trade and what you should know about it? Welcome to a new episode of Uncovering Untold Stories, a channel where we talk about the secret and hidden historical stories, events and incidents of the past that find their roots in either religious or history books. It's a place where you will hear the most unorthodox and hard-to-believe stories that have been forgotten but are part of history, shaping our lives to this day. In this episode, we will tell you about the history of the Arab or Islamic slave trade. Let's get started. In 1842, the British Consul General in Morocco wrote to the Sultan, wanting clarity on the Sultan's viewpoint regarding slavery and the slave trade. This came at a time when European powers, particularly Britain, were increasingly vocal about their opposition to slavery, both the transatlantic trade and other forms. The British were pushing for an end to these practices globally and were curious if the Moroccan leadership would align with these new international norms. The Sultan's response was firm. He made it clear that he had no intention of abolishing slavery or taking any measures to limit the slave trade. He justified this position by referencing the practice of slavery as an ancient norm, stating it had been in place since the time of the sons of Adam. The Sultan emphasized that no Islamic sect opposed slavery, and therefore, he saw no reason to ban a practice that was sanctioned by tradition and supported by religious interpretation. He further said that he would not forbid what the Quran allowed, nor permit what the Quran prohibited. This response laid bare the religious and cultural justifications that were commonly used to defend the institution of slavery in the Islamic world for nearly 1,300 years. Slavery in the Islamic world dates back to the 7th and 8th centuries, spanning across the regions that came under Islamic rule. Although Islam introduced certain regulations aimed at improving the treatment of slaves, the practice itself was not abolished. However, it cannot be said that Islam sanctioned or endorsed slavery. Because it was the norm of the time, the Quran included verses on how slaves should be treated instead of banning slavery altogether and losing importance in people's eyes who considered slavery essential. Over time, the caliphs expanded on these regulations, but the institution of slavery remained intact. There were 4 main ways a person could become a slave: being born to enslaved parents, being captured in a jihad, the holy war against non-Muslims, being purchased, or being given as a tribute. Generally, those living under Islamic rule, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, could not be enslaved unless they rebelled or supported an enemy. The slave trade in the Islamic world was diverse, involving people from various ethnic backgrounds. Different ethnic groups were perceived to possess different strengths and were often assigned specific roles based on these perceptions. For example, Indians and Nubians were typically employed as guards. East Africans were used as laborers, servants, and eunuchs, while Turks were chosen as soldiers. This categorization reflects that slavery in the Islamic world was not purely based on race, but also on perceived capabilities. However, there was a notable distinction between different groups of slaves. White slaves, known as Mamluks, could rise to significant positions of power and influence, as seen in the powerful Mamluk dynasties in Egypt and India. Yes, they founded dynasties, which shows the power they could wield. In contrast, black slaves generally had far less social mobility. The treatment and perception of African slaves in the Islamic world were often less favorable compared to slaves of other ethnicities. Historical accounts and literature frequently reveal a preference for slaves of other backgrounds over Africans. An account from the chronicler Jashiyari, for instance, narrates a story in which a provincial governor sent a black slave as a gift to the last Umayyad caliph. The caliph's secretary, Abd al-Hamid, wrote a letter of both gratitude and disdain, implying that if a less valuable gift could have been found than a black slave, it would have been sent instead. This story, among others, illustrates the bias against African slaves and the preference for other ethnicities. While the term Arab slave trade is often used to describe this network, it is essential to understand that it was not limited to Arabs or the Arab region. Although East Africa was a significant route, the trade also spanned other paths across the Sahara, through the Indian Ocean, and overland to parts of Asia and the Middle East. This extensive network indicates the global nature of the trade and the involvement of various players beyond the Arab world. But let's talk about how Islam started and spread in slavery. Slavery in the Islamic world has a long history, dating back to the early days of Islam. During the time of Prophet Muhammad, slavery was a widely accepted institution in Arabia and the surrounding regions. Slaves came from a variety of ethnic and geographical backgrounds, including Byzantines, Persians, and Africans. While Africans were initially just one of the many groups subjected to enslavement, over time, the number of African slaves in the Islamic world grew disproportionately. This shift was driven by several factors, including geopolitical changes, the stabilization of Islamic borders, and the economic and social demands of the growing Islamic empire. In the early Islamic period, slavery was not solely based on race. It was heavily influenced by religion, warfare, and social status. The rapid expansion of the Islamic caliphates in the 7th and 8th centuries resulted in a diverse influx of slaves into the Islamic world. These slaves were captured from various regions, including the Byzantine Empire, Persia, and Africa. In early Islamic society, slaves occupied a range of roles, from domestic servants to soldiers and skilled laborers. Although the Quran and Hadith set forth specific guidelines for the humane treatment of slaves, the institution itself was not abolished. During the time of Prophet Muhammad, slavery was deeply embedded in the social structure, inherited from pre-Islamic Arabian traditions and the broader Near Eastern region. Slaves could be acquired as war captives, through debt bondage, or by being sold into slavery. Islam introduced reforms aimed at improving the conditions of slaves, such as advocating for better treatment, encouraging the emancipation of slaves as a charitable act, and prohibiting the enslavement of free individuals. However, these reforms did not eliminate the practice of slavery. Instead, they sought to soften some of its harsher aspects. As the Islamic caliphates expanded and their borders stabilized, the sources and demographics of slaves shifted significantly. Initially, many slaves were captured during military campaigns and raids against non-Muslim territories, particularly in the Byzantine and Persian empires. However, as Islam spread into these areas and large populations of Turks, Persians, and Indians converted to Islam, the pool of non-Muslims eligible for enslavement dwindled. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos about little heard and untold real historical stories. Let's continue now. Islamic law generally prohibited the enslavement of Muslims, leading to a decline in the number of slaves from these newly converted regions. By the mid-8th century, as the rate of Islamic conquests slowed, there were fewer non-Muslim prisoners available for enslavement. As a result, the number of white slaves captured from European territories through wars and raids also decreased. These captives were often ransomed or exchanged rather than permanently enslaved. Consequently, the focus of the slave trade gradually shifted towards Africa, where Muslim traders began to rely more heavily on African slaves. This shift in the slave trade was not merely due to racial preference, it was also a reflection of the evolving geopolitical and religious landscape. The increasing reliance on African slaves was also supported by existing trade networks and agreements. For example, early treaties between Muslim traders and Nubian leaders ensured a steady supply of slaves in exchange for peace. This arrangement helped maintain stability along the southern borders of the Islamic Empire, but also institutionalized the trade of African slaves. Nubia, located along the Nile in what is now Sudan, supplied slaves to the Islamic world, which likely contributed to the kingdom's relative autonomy and survival during this period. As Islamic influence expanded across the Sahara and deeper into sub-Saharan Africa, new trade routes were established, linking the Islamic heartland with various parts of Africa. Slaves were transported along these routes, along with other commodities like gold and ivory. This trade network eventually expanded to include the East African coast, known as the Coast of the Zanj. From here, slaves were transported across the Indian Ocean to places like Yemen and Oman, and further into the Persian Gulf, reaching cities such as Basra and Baghdad. These cities became central hubs for the slave trade, where African slaves were bought and sold across the Islamic world. Within the Islamic world, African slaves played diverse roles, ranging from domestic servants to soldiers and laborers. In regions like Mesopotamia, a significant number of Zanj slaves, who were primarily East Africans, brought through the Indian Ocean trade, were employed on agricultural plantations and in saltpeter mines. The working conditions in these plantations and mines were notoriously harsh, leading to several slave revolts, the most notable of which occurred between 868 and 883 CE. Known as the Zanj Rebellion, this uprising posed a substantial threat to the Abbasid Caliphate, highlighting the scale and brutality of slavery in these regions. Despite the presence of slaves from various ethnic backgrounds, a clear social hierarchy existed within the Islamic world. White slaves, often referred to as Mamluks, generally enjoyed better conditions and had more opportunities for upward mobility compared to their African counterparts. Mamluks, who were primarily of Turkish, Circassian, or Caucasian descent, were often trained as soldiers and could rise to prominent military and political positions. In contrast, African slaves were typically assigned to more menial and labor-intensive roles with limited opportunities for social advancement. While it is frequently argued that religion, rather than race, was the primary distinction between slaves and non-slaves in the Islamic world, this principle was not always consistently applied. Islamic law prohibited the enslavement of free Muslims, but there were numerous instances where black Muslims were enslaved, reflecting the complexities and contradictions in the enforcement of these laws. Furthermore, despite the theoretical protections offered by Islamic law, racial prejudice often influenced the treatment of African slaves. Historical accounts and literature frequently depicted Africans in a negative light compared to other ethnic groups. One of the most notable aspects of the slave trade in the Islamic world was its integration into religious practices, particularly during the annual Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. Mecca, the holiest city in Islam, became one of the most active slave markets in the Islamic world. Pilgrims from across the Muslim world, traveling to perform the Hajj, often bought and sold slaves as part of their pilgrimage. Slaves were brought to Mecca as commodities, valued for their portability and ease of transport. For many traders, slaves were easier to protect and transport than other valuable goods, making them a lucrative trade item. The sale of slaves continued in Mecca up until 1962. Historical records, such as those by the renowned 14th century historian Ibn Khaldun, document the scale of this trade. He noted a significant black slave population in North Africa, stating that blacks made up the ordinary mass of slaves, highlighting how widespread and normalized slavery had become in these societies. Muslim Berber groups, especially the Tuareg and Moors of North Africa, played a critical role in raiding and trafficking black slaves to North Africa, Spain, Turkey, and the broader Mediterranean world. Some slaves were even transported as far as India. As early as the 8th century, the Berber Ibadi community of North Africa had almost complete control over the trade routes, giving them significant power over the movement of black slaves. This control enabled them to establish an extensive network for capturing, transporting, and selling slaves, effectively connecting sub-Saharan Africa with the broader Islamic world. The conditions slaves endured during their transport were incredibly harsh and often deadly. The journey from the African interior to the slave markets of North Africa and beyond was filled with danger, disease, and death. Some historians estimate that for every slave who survived to be sold, 10 others died along the way due to these brutal conditions. Slave raids were often framed as jihad, or holy wars, to justify the capture and enslavement of non-Muslims. This religious framing provided a layer of legitimacy to what were, in reality, often predatory and violent raids. Both the Muslim raiders and the buyers of slaves were generally indifferent to the origins or identities of the captives, focusing instead on maintaining a steady supply of labor and trade goods. The Swahili coast, in particular, became a thriving center for slave trading, with a network stretching across the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. During the 18th and 19th centuries, when the ivory trade was at its peak, slaves were also forced to carry ivory and other precious commodities to markets. The combined demand for both ivory and slaves led to an increase in the number and brutality of raids in the African interior. While the transatlantic slave trade began to wane in the early 19th century, as most European countries abolished slavery, the slave trade in Eastern Africa and the broader Islamic world continued to flourish. The British and other European powers tried to pressure Muslim rulers to abolish slavery, but these efforts largely failed. This resistance to abolition persisted even as European colonial powers began to exert more control over African territories in the late 19th century. It was only with the near-total colonization of Africa by European powers, such as Britain, that the slave trade was finally brought to an end in many parts of the continent. By the end of the 19th century, the geopolitical landscape had changed dramatically. The Ottoman Empire, once a dominant force in the Islamic world, was now often referred to as the sick man of Europe, struggling to maintain control over its territories. European powers increasingly isolated countries that continued to practice slavery, applying economic and political pressure to end the trade. These combined factors contributed to the gradual decline of slavery in the Islamic world. In 1962, Saudi Arabia officially outlawed slavery, marking a significant turning point in the region's history. What do you think? Did the Arab slave trade inspire the Europeans to enslave Africans? Isn't it true that slavery existed in every part of the world and was justified in various ways, sometimes using scientific reasons and sometimes using religion? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on the fact that no form of slavery can be ever considered milder and less brutal than the other. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on stories that might sound controversial, mysterious, and shocking, but are real and have roots in religious and history books. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.